Hi, everyone. Welcome to this important webinar on Jewish communal reactions to annexation. My name is Shana Wasserman, and I'm the Vice President for Communal Relations for J Street. And it's my privilege to introduce our two incredible speakers and our moderator today. Rabbi Jill Jacobs is the Executive Director of TRA, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights. I feel lucky to call Jill a friend and a great colleague. J Street works with TRA regularly. Rabbi Jill Jacobs is the author of several books, and her writing can be seen in a variety of reputable news outlets as well as Facebook and Twitter. She has been named 3 times to the Forward's list of 50 influential American Jews and to Newsweek's list of the 50 most influential rabbis in America. Jill, we're glad to have you with us. Our second speaker today is Dr. Stephen Windmueller, who is a personal mentor of mine and friend. Stephen is the Rabbi Alfred Gottschalk Emeritus Professor of Jewish Communal Service at HUC-JIR. He was the Dean of Hebrew Union College's LA campus as well. He's held a number of prominent positions within the Jewish community, including as the Executive Director of the Community Relations Committee of the Jewish Federation of Los Angeles and as a Federation Director in upstate New York. Dr. Windmueller is a specialist on political issues and American Jewish affairs. He also writes and speaks prolifically about trends in the American Jewish community. Thank you both for being here. I'm now going to turn it over to our moderator for today, Dr. Ruti Kadish, the Director of Communal Relations for J Street. Ruti has a PhD in Near Eastern Studies from UC Berkeley, and Ruti has lived and worked both in Israel and the United States. As I turn it over to her, I want to remind you that if you have a question and you're watching us via Zoom, you can put it in the Q&A feature and we will be sure to get to it. Ruti.
Thank you, Shana, and thank you, Stephen and Jill, for being with us. I'm excited to be part of this conversation, this very important conversation, and thank you to everyone who's joining us online. I can't see you, but I am sure you're out there, and I'm excited to be in conversation with you as well. So the Jewish communal responses to annexation. So July 1st came and went. We were anticipating anticipating July 1st and nervous about it, preparing for it, and it came and went, and there was, thank goodness, no annexation, and still none, and hopefully there won't be. But as you can imagine, as an advocacy organization that works toward a diplomatic solution, toward ensuring Israel remains the democratic homeland of the Jewish people, working towards self-determination rights for both Palestinians and Israelis, we are very concerned about annexation and the responses to annexation, and want to ensure that, and obviously want to ensure that the responses are ones that help us move to preventing annexation and help us move again towards our mission of a diplomatic solution. So we are looking around. We were looking around before July 1st and following July 1st to see what are the responses and who are our allies in this work, who hasn't responded, who hasn't, and thus this conversation. So the first thing I want to turn to Jill. I want to start with you, and could you talk a little bit about why annexation is something that we should be speaking out about? Why should Jewish organizations speak out against annexation?
Thank you so much. So first of all, thank you so much to Shana and to Ruti and to everyone at J Street. It's really, as Shana said, we work together so closely. So it's really a pleasure to be in this conversation together. And also with Stephen, who I know, gotten to know just a little bit. It's lovely to be with you. So I want to start with why annexation matters, and then maybe get to what you started to talk about in terms of how are we seeing the response. So annexation matters because it will create a situation, if Israel decides to annex part of the West Bank, it will create a situation in which there are some numbers of Palestinians who are absorbed into Israel without the citizenship rights that ordinarily goes with living in a country. And not only do they not have Israeli citizenship, but of course Palestinians by and large don't have any citizenship. So that will be a massive moral issue. And I want to be really clear about this, because sometimes when we talk about annexation, a lot of the conversation is on the practical issues the security issues. Is this good for Israel? Is it bad for Israel? Is it going to make Israel more secure or less secure? And I want to be really clear that we should be talking about this as a moral issue, that it's immoral for there to be two classes of people living in a single country under different legal systems. Now, of course, Palestinians Palestinians who are not Israeli citizens, Palestinians who are living in the West Bank, in Gaza, in East Jerusalem, are already living under a variety of different legal systems. So we can talk about that more. But by annexing part or all of the West Bank, really part is more likely, we would be creating a legal situation in which some people living in Israel would not have the same access to citizenship that others living in Israel have, and that is immoral. Annexation has been condemned, annexation in general, not only by Israel, has been consistently condemned by the international community. And one of the impacts of that has been that we actually have fewer wars to acquire territory than we once did. So this is something real. It's not just about words in a page. It's actually about stopping wars that are meant to annex, to conquer territory. So I'll start with that, and maybe just to say, I guess maybe I'll pause there because we're going to get into how the Jewish community responded in a moment, I think.
Sorry, couldn't find the unmute button. Thank you, Jill. I want to turn to Stephen now, and slightly in a different context. You've spent your career polling the Jewish community and understanding Jewish communal behavior. And so maybe you can start us off with some general sociological information about Jewish polling data and what that can tell us about institutional behaviors generally and in this particular moment.
Well, thank you, Ruti, and it's a pleasure to be with you and to have the opportunity as well to work with Rabbi Jill Jacobs, who really is an extraordinary voice within the Jewish world, and to Shana Wasserman, my former student and a wonderful professional in our community. Ruti, to your question, overwhelmingly American Jews have expressed a opposition or oppose annexation. We see this in studies by the American Jewish Committee. We also see it through a J Street study that was completed in 2018. We have other data as well of larger audiences, including Jews and non-Jews, as the University of Maryland's study this year with the Brookings Institution confirms that looking at this through the lens of Democrats and Republicans, we see really two outcomes. We see a perspective of Democrats and independents in many ways, urging and supporting a two-state model, and certainly evangelical Republicans and some other Republican voices pushing the other way. So what we are looking at is an overwhelming expression, certainly within the Jewish community, that has raised and continues to raise concerns about annexation. And what we see in the larger public sphere are similar divides and expressions associated with this complex question.
Thank you. Thank you for that, kind of laying out the lay of the land. So to take that, if in fact, when you say there's overwhelmingly Jews oppose annexation, and it breaks down somewhat on Democratic and Republican lines, if we know that Jews overwhelmingly, and to say overwhelmingly I think it's safe to say over 70% vote Democrat, I think that kind of gives us a picture of when we say overwhelmingly, what we mean by that in real numbers. So I think that's very, very helpful for us to understand in terms of the kind of work we're trying to do and the kind of changes we're trying to make in the Jewish community in order to create space for the political class to make change in that. So I want to go now to Jill and following up back to you and following up on what Stephen was saying in terms of the data, right? We have overwhelmingly, the data show that overwhelmingly Jews oppose annexation. And yet when we look at the Jewish communal or organizational responses, we're not seeing an overwhelming response from the institutions to that effect, right? We sort of have a disparity between what Jews out there believe and what the institutions say. And then and so I'm wondering if you can say something about that. That's first part of the question. And the second part of the question is it possible to not have a response? Is it possible to just be neutral about this? You know, I would say that the silence is speak. Not to speak is in itself a response, but can you have a neutral response? So
yeah, great. Okay, so let me start with the good news, and then we'll get to the bad news. So the good news is, yes, it's true that the overwhelming majority of American Jews are opposed to annexation. We also know that the overwhelming majority of American Jews, or at least a majority of American Jews, are opposed to occupation, opposed to settlements, are generally supportive of Israel and critical of the Israeli government. So we have polling that says all of that. And you're right, Ruti, that when we look at what's coming out of a lot of the legacy organizations and the so-called mainstream organizations, that's not necessarily what we might think. So the good news is on annexation, we have seen some movement. So first I'll say that I'll talk about the progressive sphere. One of the major, really important new developments of the last year, just a little over maybe a year and a month ago, we launched the Progressive Israel Network, which is a network of 10 organizations, including Trua, which organizes more than 2,000 rabbis across the US and Canada, J Street, Americans for Peace Now, New Israel Fund, and 6 other organizations. And that allows us to have a much stronger collective voice that certainly is being heard. Second piece of good news, out of the Progressive Israel Network, we organized a letter from more than 850 rabbis very strongly opposing annexation. And more good news, on the mainstream front, what we have seen is organizations that are not accustomed to criticizing Israel at all come out with what might feel like minor criticisms, but are maybe a big step for those organizations. So whether it's ADL signing onto a letter opposing annexation, or even AJ Committee putting out an op-ed that many of us read as morally bankrupt, as it, I believe, was, saying annexation is bad, but we'll defend it anyway. Okay, that's a highly problematic statement, but I think that at least they thought that saying annexation is bad was a big step. And we've seen the Rabbinical Assembly, my rabbinic organization, came out with a statement against annexation a few weeks ago. So the Union for Reform Judaism, the Reform Movement. So we see organizations that are considered mainstream organizations that perhaps aren't known for speaking against occupation, that are taking perhaps what feels like small steps, but steps toward opposing annexation. Now, of course, the challenge is going to be that if and when the threat of annexation disappears for at least a while, right now we're in a situation where the July 1st deadline has come and gone, Netanyahu is in a very bad political position, there might be elections, it's probably annexation is not going to happen soon. There's not the political will in Israel to make it happen. And so the danger is that a lot of those organizations will say, okay, phew, we got through that, we're done, let's go back to business as usual. But there can't be business as usual because the occupation still exists and we still have Israel having sovereignty over 5 million people who are not citizens and are living under various legal situations depending on where they live. And so that will be the next push to say to those mainstream organizations, okay, like, good job, you took a step, and now we have to also oppose occupation and what has become really de facto creeping annexation. And then in terms of neutrality, you know, we learned from the Talmud that silence is akin to consent. And that is an important statement, that this is a moment that calls us to say something. In the name of a famous essay by Abraham Joshua Heschel, this is no time for neutrality. And very, very often there's a trend, this is not only in the Jewish world, it's also in the general world, that sometimes people want to be the moderates who kind of rise above the fray and say, well, it's, you know, there's some people who say this and some people who say that, and at least purport to be nuanced and intellectual and, you know, just above all the partisan conversations, but in fact, more often than not, those stances end up just reinforcing the right wing. And I'll give just one example. Jewish Federations of North America, JFNA, put out a letter or an FAQ kind of fact sheet on annexation. And they said a few things. I know J Street did a good job of marking this up online, right? So it said, for example, they said annexation, what is annexation? Annexation, which in Israel, which it's what the world calls annexation, Israel calls applied sovereignty or something like that. Annexation is what Israel calls applied sovereignty. Now, it's true that the current right-wing Israeli government calls it applied sovereignty because they don't want to say the word annexation, because you hear annexation and you think about Crimea and you think that's bad. The whole world was against Russia annexing Crimea. That was really clear. So the right wing in Israel creates this euphemism for annexation, but applied sovereignty is not a term of international law, whereas annexation is a term of international law, right? So annexation should not actually be a controversial term, like occupation shouldn't be a controversial term, because it's a description of what happens, right? There's occupations that happen after wars, like the Allies occupying Germany, right? There's occupations happen. They're not necessarily bad in and of themselves, and there are specific laws that apply to occupation, and also they're supposed to be tempered. And so by even making that choice of saying that this could be something besides annexation, which is presented as some say this and some say that, actually it's reinforcing that language that it could be something other than annexation, which is in fact a term that Israel made up. So that's one of the ways, again, saying, well, it's not really occupation, it's disputed territory, when in fact the Israeli Supreme Court, the IDF, Ariel Sharon, all use the word occupation because that is a technical legal description of what the situation is. It's not a political position. And yet by creating a different word to describe it, like disputed territories, you make the technical legal term into a political term, which it is not.
That's Jill, that's really interesting that you lay that out in that way. I saw a video clip or an interview with some young teens living in the territories, and they were asked about annexation, and they said, no, it's not annexation, it's ribonut. It's exactly, the sovereignty. The sovereignty. So exactly changing the terminology and thus reframing it, and exactly true. And I also appreciate the point about the Talmud teaching us that the silences speak. I was thinking more of the from Foucault, but maybe Foucault got it from the Talmud. So appreciate that it in fact is true. There is no time, there's no neutral there. There's no Switzerland, as it were, on this. I want to turn back to you, Stephen, and because in our conversations you have said that it's possible for organizations to serve kind of a neutral purpose or kind of above the fray. And obviously what Jill has been arguing is that it's not the time for this, nor is it possible. In the context of you responding to that, I'd also want to throw in a question that came in the chat about, are there organizations or what American groups are advocating for annexation and against annexation, and how are they doing that? So in the context of the mapping of the organizations and the ability for them to be neutral or not, if you could respond to that as well.
Thank you. In response to Jill's observations that this in a sense is a moral agenda, I would argue that it is for those who come to it with an ideological premise or base, but it is not seen that way by many of the mainstream institutions, which I think argue from a strategic and political frame that suggests that there are multiple sets of interests, and challenges to those interests require them to navigate these questions, not from the moral perspective, but from political and other agendas that define and frame their historic place in the Jewish community. We would remind ourselves that the American Jewish community is really an extraordinary composition of groups with very defined ideological perspectives. And on that, you would find on the right side of that, the Zionist Organization of America, which has historically articulated a kind of perspective of a greater Israel agenda, viewing this question as part of the legal scope by which Israel should and can define itself in a much larger and a bigger picture. It is joined within the Orthodox world of religious life by certain groups that embrace this notion, arguing it from a religious imperative. But the centerpiece of the American Jewish community, including the federation systems, the National Jewish Defense Agencies, the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee amongst them, and a whole array of other organizations, including membership groups such as Hadassah, the National Council of Jewish Women, etc., have all been part of the sort of infrastructure of American Jewish life for this past 125 years. And what is increasingly developed in the past 20 years is really sort of the repositioning of these groups. So we have the far right, if for lack of a better term, and then we have the left. But increasingly, the legacy institutions, the institutions I've most recently referenced, define themselves much more as centrist, and where they may come together around the question of having difficulties or seeing problems with annexation, they do so, as I would argue, from a political frame rather than a moral or ideological one. So in this context, let's take the American Jewish Committee, founded in 1906. The committee was never defined or never saw itself as the voice for Zionism. It was late, as it would argue, in terms of its embracing the Israel story. And as late as 1950, Jacob Blaustein, the then chairman of the board of AJC, and David Ben-Gurion engaged in a series of extraordinary letters about defining the relationship between a diaspora Jewish institution, such as the AJC, and its relationship to the Jewish state. So that we have to realize that some of these organizations are not driven by having birthed or been bound by the Israel story, but have grown to integrate Israel into their agenda. So the American Jewish Committee, as an example here, has not said it is embracing annexation. Jason Isaacson's essay argues very clearly that the committee has concerns certainly about annexation. And David Harris in his webinar clearly also backs the principle that annexation is problematic in many ways. Even for Israel, he would argue it is problematic. So I think one has to appreciate that the AJC and the ADL, for example, have multiple stakeholders, internal and external, that challenge, in a sense, the scope or range of how they respond to these questions. AJC's interests with diplomatic groups across the world, ADL's concerns about minority communities in this country, just represent two of the multiple examples of where these agencies are, in a sense, balancing policy with their interests and realities. So they are careful to try to manage these questions with these broader sets of competing interests. The ADL story is an interesting one. As you may recall, the ADL was founded in 1913 and was actually a part of B'nai B'rith. So its current life over the past 30 to 40 years has been much more a reflective voice on its own as against the B'nai B'rith role that it historically had played. And ADL did not see itself as a major voice on Israel in the sense of defending and protecting certain policies of Israel until much later in its evolution and development. So that the current administration at ADL, even reflected by a memo that was leaked to the Jewish Currents in June of this year, showing how difficult and complex it is for an agency such as the League to identify how it will maneuver on this question. considering its relationships with African American groups, with a cross-section of religious institutions, and its various other agendas, all competing with this story. So I think the bottom line here is that the mainstream legacy institutions have multiple challenges and stakeholders. They do not come at this from a moral perspective, but from a political set of interests, and that neutrality for them is not seen as a failure, but is seen as the reality point of pointing to the fact that internal to their organizations are voices competing inside of the institution, pushing and pulling the agencies one way or the other. So I think that many of these institutions took a major lesson from the Iran nuclear accords, where they opposed the Obama initiative or embraced it, but found themselves caught up in a huge fueling of debate as to the wisdom of their actions. So I see some of these groups behaving in part in reaction to what occurred 4 or 5 years ago in managing these questions in a far more nuanced way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I have 2 more questions, which I very much want to ask, and we have questions coming in fast and furious in the Q&A. So I'm going to ask one question to you, Jill, somewhat as a response, and I have one more question for you, Stephen, and then I'd like to open it up. So I find it fascinating to hear your analysis that this is a political consideration rather than a moral one, that these organizations don't think of this as a moral question or a moral issue, rather as a political one. And I'm curious, Jill, what your response to that is, given that you have suggested that we should very much consider this a moral issue.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Stephen. The history is really important here. I want to mention a couple of things in terms of, first of all, in terms of the history, and then also relating a little bit back to the previous question that Rudy asked about the difference between the polling and what we see coming from organizations. So something that's important about AJC under Jacob Blaustein is they were an extraordinary voice for human rights, including Blaustein himself and the other leadership soon after the war. Sorry, just getting my mic closer. Soon after the war, arguing for an international bill of human rights, including enforcement measures. And so that's part of the history. And the HAC also continues to run the Blaustein Institute, which is a very much respected human rights organization. So that is part of the history. And I think the legacy of human rights is very much the legacy of how the world responded to the Holocaust, since the world was pitifully not concerned at all with what was happening to Jews, and in many cases considered it an internal Jewish problem, that part of the world's response was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and really some of the very first human rights legislation. So that's part of our legacy, and we need to hold on to that. In terms of the moral question, you didn't say this explicitly, but one of the ways in which some of the questions around Israel often get framed is that it's a zero-sum game between human rights and security. And that is an incredibly unhelpful framing. I'm not saying that you did that, you didn't, but often that's how people frame it. Because what we should be concerned about is the human rights of both Israelis and Palestinians. Both have the exact same human rights that all of us have just by virtue of being human. The same rights to having citizenship in a country, the same rights to having voting rights, to self-determination, all of the basic human rights that are laid out by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and various international conventions since then. So we should start there. And of course, in that is the right to safety and security. And when some of us talk about the need for a two-state solution, which is where TRA continues to stand, and I know J Street does as well, what we're talking about is ensuring that we have two states that have defined borders. And that is a way of making Israelis safer, because instead of sending 18-year-old kids deep into the West Bank, you now have, instead, you have soldiers who are defending borders. That's what, countries have borders and, would defend any incursion into their borders. So it's not about either you get security for Israel or you get human rights. The goal is to have human rights and security for both Israelis and Palestinians. That's a little redundant because security should be part of human rights, but I want to say both. And then the last piece, this is getting back to the question about, well, why aren't mainstream organizations acting the way that the polls would suggest? And so there we have to talk about money. And we have to talk about where the money in the Jewish community is. So we know that the right in the Jewish community puts billions and billions of dollars into, one, changing actual facts on the ground in Israel, whether that's through contributing to build and support settlements, whether it's through, like the Tikva Fund does, funding public policy think tanks in Israel that are actually changing public policy and determining public policy there. So really, certainly tens of millions, if not billions of dollars into funding the Israeli right, funding the settlement project, putting facts on the ground. And also, we know that the American right is putting extraordinary amounts of money into US organizations pushing a pro-occupation agenda, or at least staying off of rejecting occupation, toward putting so many communal resources into fighting BDS and fighting any campus organizations that are criticizing Israel, perhaps even in ways we don't like. There's lots of people who are criticizing Israel in ways that I find to be fairly problematic, and free speech includes speech that we really find distasteful. So that's where so much of our communal money goes. We have organizations like the IAC, the Israeli American Council, that is, maybe, in addition to doing cultural programs for Israeli Americans, also pushes policies, right-wing policies and advocacy. We have money, we have the ZOA, we have all of this money that's going into Hasbara, or explaining Israel, turning attention away from the occupation. So that's where a lot of the money is going. And in the liberal Jewish community, of course, there is, thankfully, money that's going into J Street and Torah and the other progressive Israel network organizations. But by and large, the liberal Jewish community is not as laser focused on Israel as the right is. So liberal Jewish money is also going to the ACLU and Planned Parenthood and local organizations and museums and universities. Not to say that's not, that there's anything wrong with it. I also give money to the ACLU and Planned Parenthood, but liberal Jewish money is going there, or it's going into so-called neutral organizations. So I think somebody in the Q&A mentioned JNF. So JNF USA still puts money into settlements. Tra ran a major campaign around that a few years ago that got them to at least release the documents so we know exactly how much money they're putting in to the settlements. Or to, whether it's to our federations, again, we should give to federations. They do amazing, really amazing work locally and otherwise, but it's about putting money into organizations that are neutral. I'm not even saying that some of these organizations are doing bad things. Many of them, federations, officially don't fund over the green line, for example, but we're not putting money into where our ideology is. We're not putting money into as much into funding the ideology and the vision that we want to see. And it is a challenge that I'll pose to those of us who are on the call who are strong opponents of annexation to say, how is it that we're using the power of our checkbooks to make sure that we see the Jewish communal voice that we want?
Thank you, Jill. And so I just want to one final quick question, hopefully for Stephen, then I want to open it up to the questions, and essentially dovetailing a bit on what Jill, you were saying. Stephen, as someone who's examined, polled, studied in depth the Jewish communal behavior, I'm wondering how we as an organization that is eager to move the politics on this issue, how do we get the community to move in that direction, to actually walk its talk, in a sense, to express really the majority opinion of over 70% of the population. In preparation for this call, we established that we agree that annexation is bad morally, politically, for Israel, for the Palestinians, just on every level. We agreed that that both people deserve self-determination, security, safety. We agreed that we want peace and justice for both. So how do we get the mainstream legacy institutions that, again, represent the entire Jewish community, of which over 70% agree with us? How do we get them to stand up more forcefully? How do we get them to act and essentially to live their values? I'm curious if you have any insight that could help us as an organization trying to move those institutions to insight that could help us do the work we do.
Well, I think we need to acknowledge that the Jewish community is deeply divided, and that many of the institutions that we're talking about this afternoon are institutions that clearly don't necessarily reflect the full body of Jewish expression or viewpoints. They reflect the audiences and members that they serve. So we begin with the fact that we have institutions that have very clear demarcated membership base that define and reflect the interests and the goals that many of these institutions are projecting. So the divisions in the Jewish community become our first challenge. The second is that many of these groups do not begin with the moral or ideological positions that are found on the left or on the right, and see the framing of these questions very much around the politics, the economics, the culture, and the interests of their respective institutional worlds. So to create a conversation with the center, for example, leaving aside the political right, I think it begins with the notions that one begins not on the Israel question in all candor. I think one has to step back and begin on conversations where we find common ground associated with who we are as American Jews, what we are concerned about in terms of security for Jews, but security for the state of Israel, and begin to build from a point of where we have certain commonalities and agreements, and then to identify the particular areas of where we disagree and how we may either bridge or agree to disagree in framing where we go forward. I'm not certain that it's beneficial to begin this with a sort of we-they scenario. I think we begin with the framing of what, as I suggest, are the shared values and interests and concerns that we as American Jews share or have with one another.
Thank you. And I think that really speaks to, I didn't ask you to say that, but right, that speaks to what J Street stands for, right? We're motivated by a deep concern for Israel's survival as a democratic homeland for the Jewish people and for self-determination, and know that for that to happen, and also because of informed by our Jewish and democratic values, that both peoples deserve self-determination, safety, and security. So that's exactly where we're coming from. So I'm going to open it up or ask some questions here on the chat, and I won't necessarily go in order. But one question here for you, Stephen, is how about JCRCs, who supposedly represent the Jewish community? They show concern but haven't forcefully spoken out against annexation. So I think what you see in terms of the behaviors of JCRCs is also reflected in the Federation world in general, is that the players in the established institutions of communal life reflect the diversities that we have already identified in our conversation of people who are Republican Jews and Democratic Jews, who are Jews with varying degrees of opinion about Israel, about anti-Semitism, about community, and about the social values and systems that they ascribe to.
JCRC cannot act unilaterally. It needs the consensus of its members or its participants. And so we are, in a sense, living with these kinds of boundaries of how organizations operate. They simply don't necessarily reflect the passions and maybe the visions of Jews that sit outside of these institutional walls. We need to remind ourselves that the so-called organized Jewish community accounts for about 25 to 30% of the American Jewish scene, which means there are literally 70%, 75% of American Jews sit outside of these sort of formal institutional connections. Some may have minimalist relationships by making a donation to their federation or a gift to the ADL or Hadassah or the National Council of Jewish Women. But in terms of their engagement with the daily political and social and moral questions that are being described and discussed in this conversation, often sit beyond many Jewish voices and voters who are simply not part of these connections.
That speaks to, there's a question here in the chat about the magnitude of the funding from right, center, and left, various American Jewish organizations. And there was also another one related to, there was a, I'm sorry, I'm now losing it, but they're about what the percentage of people, I may have lost the question, the percentage of people belong to these organizations or are affiliated with these organizations. Did you have, Stephen, did you have anything on that, on the funding from the?
Well, I mean, if we take a look at the American Jewish enterprise, sociologists and economists suggest it's in excess of $10 billion of the dollars raised to support schools and camps, synagogues, federations, agencies, Israel-American institutions, and the various other cultural and academic resources of our community. This makes us the second largest infrastructure of its kind. The Roman Catholic Church is certainly the largest. So that the Jewish community, for its size, which is that we are 2% of the American audience, the reality is that the Jewish community is a very structured system. But that structured system is in radical change. And what we began to see already in the 1980s is the nature of that change. The arrival on the scene are Trua, J Street, and a host of other institutions that are very much focused on a different model or an alternative model to the legacy or as against the boutique models that these groups represent. We see this in the synagogue world, we see it in political behavior, we see it in Israel-related matters, and we see it also in terms of delivery of social and human services. So we are actually living with two systems of which J Street and Trua are part of this new and evolving and important alternative voice, which is basically saying to the established system, you know, there is a different way forward and a different modality of thinking. So we're in a cultural sort of conflict or divide here that is part of what is taking place.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you, I actually want to add another question to that, to you, that there's a question here in the chat about that is the argument that the ADL and the AJC have their own history. Is it, as the questioner as the person writes, a bit forgiving of their equivocation? And I guess this speaks to Jill's point about, is it really about their donor base that they're concerned about? I don't know if either of you wants to take that.
Maybe Jill would like to offer some comments.
Sure. I mean, I think, Stephen, if you have the numbers, I can speak anecdotally about what I hear, and I'm guessing that you actually have the research that you've done. So I'll say that anecdotally, yes. When I talk to whether it's leaders of mainstream organizations or also rabbis, who obviously I talk to a lot, what I hear is that if they take a position that is even an inch to the left, they get yelled at by their more right-wing donors. This is, certainly rabbis have this all the time. And we've seen rabbis whose jobs have been threatened because of work that they did with Torah, for example, because they went to the West Bank with us even, because their name was associated with us, because they gave a sermon that said the word occupation. So we hear this all the time, and certainly from mainstream organizations, we hear also that their donors on the right are calling them and yelling at them. Now, again, that's a very loud minority. And the majority, this is maybe an invitation to everybody on the call, or at least everybody who holds this position, that even if the majority is against annexation, against occupation for 2 states, rabbis and Jewish organizational leaders don't necessarily hear from them. That's the group of people who tend to just either be quiet or just leave. Like Stephen talked about, that there are many people who don't get involved in JCRCs or other local organizations that are perceived as mainstream because they say, oh, that's too far right for me, right? But then those voices aren't heard. I know this talking to JCRC directors, they get yelled at by the right and the left just walks away. And so that's an important lesson for us, that the majority, none of us should yell or threaten people's jobs or things like that. But to be able to speak up, whether it's even to say thank you. An invitation for everybody on this call, if you are connected to a synagogue or any other institution that has a rabbi, check whether your rabbi signed on to the letter opposing annexation. You can find it on the TRA website. And if they did, call them and say thank you. They probably have heard from some people who are mad, and all the silent majority who wants to say thank you didn't think, oh, I should thank my rabbi. So that is definitely anecdotally a fact of life. And Stephen, I'm sure that you have some numbers also on that. That's not my job.
As Jill points out, it's really a major challenge for congregational rabbis, for JCRC directors, and for other institutional leaders to at times articulate a personal perspective or what they believe to be a moral or even political perspective, so that the Jewish community, in its steep fracturing, is a community that has these immense numbers of stories of rabbis losing pulpits and of professionals losing their career path. So I think the confirmation is in the reality of the inability to create a safe and secure playing field for conversations around these questions. It is not that one ought to, in my view, isolate and say that the right is not welcomed, but is to embrace the different perspectives in conversations that allow for this to be much more measured and played out, and where voices of reason understand where the other parties are coming from. In the 1980s, to the credit of the Jewish Federation of Los Angeles, the Council on Jewish Life here in Los Angeles began a series of dialogues, realizing that we were at the verge of what this now has become really sadly, the epidemic of Jewish discourse, which is discrediting, marginalization, and isolation, and began to talk about how do Jews talk to one another. Now, I know today there are a variety of intersections of this, of interdisciplinary efforts to create alternative ways for conversation. So this is tragically the bottom line question. American Jews are not able or in a position to articulate in an open and free space these kinds of differences.
Jill, I'm wondering if you want to respond to that in terms of, we want to create an open space for dialogue, and yet are there positions that are beyond the pale? We know that,
sure.
I know that we've talked a bit about cancel culture, if you want to refer to that.
Yeah, I think we should have an open dialogue on Israel, open conversation on Israel. Currently, we do not. As Stephen said, there's many initiatives to make that feel a little bit more possible. And most conversations, I'm sure most of us have experienced this on Israel, tend to resort to yelling and name calling and recycling talking points. And, it's a very touchy issue. People feel very strongly and about it emotionally and otherwise. But that's to say, we should have a really open conversation about it, and it shouldn't be that we can't talk about two states or one state or different varieties of what different states could look like. Like, that should all be open for conversation. Like I said before, I don't either personally or organizationally support or belong to the BDS movement, but we do believe in free speech, and the right to boycott is included in free speech. Just like, my family isn't buying Goya right now, so that is our free speech, and it's somebody else's free speech to go out and buy Goya. In terms of what should be on the table, off the table, I would say calling for genocide and murder. So that is, those who would advocate transfer or either like massive crimes against humanity on one side, or people on the other side who would straight out say Jews should go back, Israeli Jews should go back where they came from, as if that were even possible. So I'd say anything that stops short of calling for either mass deportation of either group or genocide, or certainly anything that crosses the line into incitement, against individuals or against groups. We've certainly seen the dangers of incitement in Israel, obviously with the murder of Prime Minister Rabin, and also in some of the attacks against Israeli human rights leaders, sometimes physical attacks. So I would say that once you stay away from those two extremes, then we should be able to talk about everything else.
Thank you. Thanks. So we're nearing the end of our time, and I'd like to, we can't get to all the questions, but I want to give each of you maybe a couple of minutes just to sum up any thoughts you have on where we as a community, and I sort of broadly the Jewish community, move forward when we all agree that annexation is a net negative and something we want to oppose, prevent. And as people involved in the Jewish community, what are maybe steps that Jill, you mentioned in terms of individual people turning to their rabbis, for example, if they've spoken out on this, and thank them, and if they haven't, asked them to. But just in general, kind of last words on how we move the Jewish communal response to one that helps us stop this and helps us in our work of getting to a diplomatic solution, safety and security and such. Stephen, you want to start? And then
first of all, thank you again for this opportunity. I would argue that we need to understand the history and evolution of the American Jewish community. We need to understand the dynamics of political and nuanced behavior. We need to respect the diversities in the community, the ideological divides that we have. And having said that, we then need to begin a process of some healing, of beginning a conversation that does not start with Israel, but starts with our humanity and our individuality as Jews, finding common ground and building from that common ground a discourse of respect and dialogue that allows for us to hear the other voice. And finally, I would argue that it does not serve us well, I believe, to view the others as somehow the problem. They are part of a kind of culture. We are part of the culture of both Americanism and Judaism, with all of its diversities and complexities. And therefore we come to this from our own particular sort of story and historical pathways. And I think we are best off when we begin without these sort of notations of believing that there is only one path forward.
thank you.
Thank you so much. And again, thank you so much to Ruti for facilitating us, and to everybody at J Street for setting this up. The main message that I would give is that we can't give up. We can't walk away. We can't say, oh, whoops, Israel is going down a non-democratic route, or the two-state solution is over, or whatever vision, if it's not two states that we have, right? We can't just walk away and give up, because someone else who doesn't have our vision is going to step in to the vacuum and push forward their vision. That's certainly what we've seen in terms of the way that the far right has just kept their eyes on the prize. So they should have lost at Oslo, but instead they kept their eyes on the prize, continued to build settlements, continued to support settlements, and we are where we are today. So we should not give up, even if it feels really hard. You know, it took us 40 years to get through the wilderness, and 2,000 years of exile. Like, the Jewish people does not give up on things short term. So that's the first piece. And the second piece is really to be vocal about where we stand and have conversations and get into those difficult conversations in our communities, with our friends, with our families. Because if nobody hears people talking about a vision for Israelis and Palestinians, if people don't hear that it's not a zero-sum game, either you're pro-Israel or you're pro-Palestinian, but you can actually care about human rights and security for both, then people start to think those positions don't exist, or certainly don't exist in the Jewish community. So we have to keep talking about them in our community. And I will give another plug for thanking your rabbi, because that's a very concrete way to start.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Jill, and thank you to all of everyone out there, and thank you for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. I tried to bring them into the conversation, but the participants, Stephen and Jill, have those questions, and we'll look at them. So thanks again for participating. And I just want to echo what both Stephen and Jill have said, that we want to keep this dialogue going. We're all here because we care about justice, and we care about the Jewish people, and we care about Jewish values, and we're trying to hold on to those both, right? To hold on to both, to all of that together, and move forward, especially in these pretty challenging times. So thanks again, stay safe, and join us again on another JStream. Thank you so much.